All right. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be from. We start this off with the third step prayer, which is on page 63 in your big book. If you want to follow along, God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Okay, we have a real treat for us today. We're on Dr. Bob's Nightmare, which is on page 171. And Bill S. has graciously agreed to take the lead today and is going to do his magic that he does with these chapters and walk us through Dr. Bob's Nightmare. So I'll put, let's see, Bob D's coming in and get. All right. So
okay, hi.
171.
Go ahead.
That's okay, Bill. Go ahead and take over, please, sir.
Okay. Hi, I'm Bill. I'm an alcoholic from New Jersey. And thanks for asking me, Lee. I appreciate this. My pleasure to always try to help out whenever I can. All right, we're on page 171, Dr. Bob's Nightmare. Dr. Bob was born August 8th, 1879, and he died November 16th, 1950. And when he got sober, he was 55 years old when Bill helped him get sober. Let me read this and I'll start explaining what went on here. There's a little introduction here before the story here. It says, a co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, the birth of our society dates from his first day of permanent sobriety, June 10th, 1935. To 1950, the year of his death, he carried the AA message to more than 5,000 alcoholic men and women, and to all these he gave his medical services without thought of charge. In this prodigy of service, he was well assisted by Sister Ignatia at St. Thomas Hospital in Akron, Ohio, one of the greatest friends our fellowship will ever know. All right, if you notice right here in the first and the second line, it says the birth of our society dates from his first day of permanent sobriety. That's the day that Alcoholics Anonymous uses as the day that our AA was founded, as June 10th, 1935. Some people sometimes have a little bit of a question on when they're supposed to count their sobriety from. AA counts the sobriety from the first day you were sober. And on June 10th, Dr. Bob had one beer in the morning, so he was sober sometime later during that day, and that's the day that they count as his first day of sobriety. Whenever you first achieve sobriety, that's when AA counts it. Some people count it from the next day or the day after or whatever, but I'm just going by what AA does and what AA says. So if you had one drink in the morning and you didn't have any more, sometime during that day, probably an hour or two later, you would be considered sober because the alcohol would be out of your system. And they have the date here as June 10th, 1935. Today, there's a little bit of a controversy going on over what the exact date was. Somebody looked up the date when they had this AMA convention that Dr. Bob went to. He supposedly went to the convention, got drunk, came back halfway through it, and he was supposed to go for surgery on June 10th. Well, when they looked up the dates of everything, they found out that the AMA convention started on June 10th. So if Dr. Bob went there, it would have had to be the next week when he came back. It would have been June 17th. So there's a little bit of a debate going on over what exactly the date was, whether it was the 10th or the 17th. But it really doesn't make much difference. I mean, to me, it doesn't matter whether he got sober 1 week or the next week. I mean, that's not going to affect any of our sobriety. It's just something, a piece of trivia, and they're still trying to figure out most people think it was the 17th now, but it really doesn't matter. The book says the 10th, so I'll go along with the 10th. And then it talks about he carried the message to more than 5,000 alcoholics. Dr. Bob was sober for 15 years. If you do the math on it, that's approximately one person a day that he carried the message to. Remember, he was a doctor. He was working in a hospital, and so he had access to a lot of people. So he probably saw 2 or 3 patients a day, and maybe one of them was an alcoholic each time. So it's very possible that he talked to 1 or 2 alcoholics almost every day of the week. So, except maybe for Saturday and Sunday, I don't know if he went to the hospital on those days, but so it's very probable that he helped 5,000 people by explaining the process that he went through to them so that they could get sober. And he not only worked in the city hospital in Akron, he was helping out in the St. Thomas Hospital. That's another hospital in Akron where Sister Ignatia was. And she helped a lot of alcoholics. She was well known in AA. She did a lot of work for us, and she was sneaking alcoholics into the hospital because they wouldn't take alcoholics at the time because they didn't think that they were sick. They thought we were crazy. And she used to sneak people in and hide them in the flower room. And Dr. Bob would come over there and try to help her, help these people get sober and whatever kind of treatment they needed. Let's go down to the next paragraph. I was born in a small New England village of about 7,000 souls. The general moral standard was, as I recall, far above average. The name of this town where he was born was St. Johnsbury, Vermont. No beer or liquor was sold in the neighborhood except at the state liquor agency, where perhaps one might procure a pint if he could convince the agent that he really needed it. I don't know if they still do this, but at the time in Vermont, the only place that you could buy any liquor was at a state liquor agency. All of the liquor stores in Vermont were run by the state. So they had the same price across the board wherever you bought something, and they didn't really care if they sold it to you because they weren't privately owned. So these people that were working for the state, so they got paid the same amount of money whether they sold anything or they didn't sell anything. So they really didn't care. They weren't trying to push to sell things. If you go into other states where they have private-owned liquor stores, they're always trying to sell you stuff. And in Vermont, they really didn't care about that. They weren't trying to sell it because everything was run by the state. Without this proof, the expectant purchaser would be forced to depart empty-handed with none of what I later believe was the great panacea for all human ills. Panacea means a cure-all. Dr. Bob believed that alcohol was the cure-all for everything. You have a headache, you take a drink. If you have a stomach ache, you take a drink. If you have a toothache, you take a drink, et cetera, whatever. So Dr. Bob thought that alcohol could cure almost everything. Men who had liquor shipped in from Boston or New York by express were looked upon with great distrust and disfavor by most of the good townspeople. The town was well supplied with churches and schools in which I pursued my early educational activities. So Dr. Bob came from a small town. There's 7,000 souls. That's not a very big town. That's kind of a small town. Everybody knows each other, that kind of thing. And that's how Dr. Bob grew up. All right, the next paragraph. My father was a professional man of recognized ability, and both my father and mother were most active in church affairs. Both father and mother were considered above average intelligence. His father was a judge, and at various times, his father was the state's attorney. He was also a member of the state legislature. He was a superintendent of schools in St. Johnsbury. He was the director of a bank, and he became the president of another bank, and he also taught Sunday school. So his father was a very, very active person, and obviously he was a very intelligent person to be able to do all of this kind of stuff. And his mother was a teacher, And to be a teacher, you have to be highly educated and you have to be pretty intelligent to be able to teach something. So both of his parents were above average intelligence, like it says here. And so Dr. Bob came from good stock, and there's a good chance that he was above average intelligent also. And we'll see that as we go through this a little bit. Unfortunately for me, I was the only child, which perhaps engendered the selfishness which played such an important part in bringing on my alcoholism. He was an only child, and he probably was very selfish when he grew up because he got everything he wanted, that kind of stuff. And most of us can probably identify with the selfishness thing because that seems to be one of the characteristics of alcoholism. An alcoholic tends to be a very selfish person. At least when it comes to our drinking, we're very selfish. We may not be selfish in other things, but when it comes to our booze, we get very selfish. I on the next paragraph on the top of page 172. From childhood through high school, I was more or less forced to go to church, Sunday school, evening service, Monday night Christian Endeavor, and sometimes through Wednesday evening prayer meetings. The high school that he went to was St. Johnsbury Academy. And he was forced to go to church, to Sunday school, Monday services, Christian Endeavor. Christian Endeavor is an organization for Protestant youth. And sometimes he had to go to Wednesday evening prayer meetings. He was given an overdose of religion. All of this stuff was forced on him as he was growing up. This had the effect of making me resolve that when I was free from parental domination, I would never again darken the doors of a church. This resolution I kept steadfastly for the next 40 years, except when circumstances made it seem unwise to absent myself. So he got to the point where he made a decision that when his parents, when he was old enough and his parents couldn't tell him what to do anymore, he was never going to darken the doors of a church again. And there's a little bit of a correlation there, like with Bill. When Bill was 11 years old, he walked out of Sunday school and said he was through with that stuff. He's never going to go back again. So both of these guys, Bill and Bob, they didn't want anything to do with religions and church and that kind of stuff. So you can see they were both kind of on the same page. That might be one of the reasons why they got along so well. The next paragraph. After high school came 4 years in one of the best colleges in the country where drinking seemed to be a major extracurricular activity. The college that he went to was Dartmouth College. That was in Hanover, New Hampshire. Almost everyone seemed to do it. I did it more and more and had lots of fun without much grief, either physical or financial. So when he went to college, everybody was drinking, or most of the people were drinking in the college, and he just jumped right in and he went along with it, and he was drinking with them. I seemed to be able to snap back the next morning better than most of my fellow drinkers who were cursed or perhaps blessed with a great deal of morning after nausea. Never once in my life have I had a headache, which fact leads me to believe that I was an alcoholic almost from the start. So whenever Dr. Bob drank, the next morning, he just got up like nothing. He slept it off and he was fine. He didn't get up. He didn't have hangovers. He wasn't sick the next day. He wasn't having any consequences for his drinking. He would just drink and party all night or whatever they were doing when they were in college. And he would wake up the next day like nothing and just go about his business. My whole life seemed to be centered around doing what I wanted to do. Does anybody identify with that? That's what alcoholics do. We do everything we want to do without regard for the rights, wishes, or privileges of anyone else. A state of mind which became more and more predominant as the years passed. I was graduated summa cum laude in the eyes of the drinking fraternity, but not in the eyes of the dean. Summa cum laude means with the highest distinction. And when somebody graduates college and they call them summa cum laude, that means they did very good at their academics. They were very smart. They got high marks and everything. So he he was considered summa cum laude in the eyes of the drinking fraternity, but not in the eyes of the dean. So he didn't do he did probably just average in college, but the drinking fraternity thought that he was great, probably because he was drinking a lot more than everybody else. He was probably one of the head drinkers or whatever you want to call it at college. The next 3 years I spent in Boston, Chicago, and Montreal in the employ of a large manufacturing concern, selling railway supplies, gas engines of all sorts, and many other items of heavy hardware. During these years, I drank as much as my purse permitted, still without paying too great penalty. Although I was beginning to have the morning jitters at times, I lost only a half day's work during these 3 years. So Dr. Bob went and got a job with some kind of a manufacturing concern. He was selling equipment, heavy hardware equipment. For 3 years he did this, and he was starting to get the morning jitters. So you can see his alcoholism is starting to progress. He's waking up every now and then with the shakes. And he only lost a half a day of work during these 3 years. So he's really not having any consequences. That's almost nothing, a half a day of work. I know people that lose a lot more time from work and they don't even drink. So he only lost a half a day because of his drinking or his jitters. That's just not a big deal. But you can see a little bit the progression is starting because he's starting to get the jitters. Normal drinkers usually don't get the jitters. You have to drink quite a lot to wake up with the shakes the next morning. My next move was to take up the study of medicine, entering one of the largest universities in the country. The university was the University of Michigan, and he entered that in 1905. There, I took up the business of drinking with much greater earnestness than I had previously shown. So you can see he's saying he started drinking more and more. He's drinking more heavy than he did when he was just in college. Now that he's in medical school, he's drinking even more. On account of my enormous capacity for beer, I was elected to membership in one of the drinking societies and soon became one of its leading spirits. Evidently, Dr. Bob could drink a lot of beer and he could hold his liquor pretty good. So he joined one of these drinking societies that they have in these different kinds of schools. Many mornings I have gone to class and even though fully prepared, would turn and walk back to the fraternity house because of my jitters, not daring to enter the classroom for fear of making a scene should I be called on for recitation. So now you can see the alcohol starting to affect him. He's missing days of school. It says many mornings, not some, not a few. He says many mornings I've gone to class and he missed his, and he had to turn around and walk back to the fraternity house because of the jitters or the shakes, if you want to call them the shakes, because he didn't want to be called on in class for recitation. That means when you have to get up in front of the class and recite something, usually something from memory that the whole class had to memorize, and he was afraid he would be called on, and if he tried to get up in front of the class, he'd be shaking so bad he would make a scene. So you can see the alcohol starting to affect him. He's missing some of the days of his school because of it. This went from bad to worse until sophomore spring, when after a prolonged period of drinking, I made up my mind that I could not complete the course. So I packed my grip and went south to spend a month on a large farm owned by a friend of mine. So he got to the point now, he left school for a month. And he went to one of his friends' where he lived on a farm, and he spent a month on the farm to try to get cleared up. And that's what we would call the geographical cure. He went away for a month to try to get better. When I got the fog out of my brain, I decided that quitting school was very foolish and that I had better return and continue my work. When I reached school, I discovered the faculty had other ideas on the subject. After much argument, they allowed me to return and take my exams, all of which I passed credibly. But they were much disgusted and told me they would attempt to struggle along without my presence. So basically what happened was he took off for a month, then he tried to go back to school, they had other ideas. They didn't really want him back there, but he argued with them, and they allowed him to take his final exams. And he passed them credibly. So you can see this guy is an intelligent person. He missed a month of school, plus however many days that he missed going to class because he had the jitters and he had to go back to the fraternity house. So he didn't get to class all the time, and he missed a month plus whatever other days he missed, and he still passed his exams credibly. So evidently he was a real pretty smart guy. Those people that don't miss any time at school and they still have trouble passing their exams. And he passed them credibly. That means he did them respectably. He got a good mark on them. But they were much disgusted and told me they would attempt to struggle along without my presence. That means we're done with you. Get out of here. Hit the road. We don't need you here anymore. After many painful discussions, they finally gave me my credits, and I migrated to another of the leading universities of the country and entered as a junior that fall. The university that he went to was Rush University, and it's near Chicago. And it's named after Benjamin Rush. And one of the, just a coincidence, Benjamin Rush was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he was also a doctor. And he advocated for the disease concept of alcoholism. Now, this is back in the 1700s. So this disease idea is not anything new. It was going around for a while. And this Dr. Benjamin Rush, he wrote papers on it, and he said that when a person drinks and they can't stop drinking, it's not just they have a moral problem or that they're a troublemaker or whatever. They have an actual illness, an actual disease. So it's just interesting that he went to a college that was named after a guy that advocated for the disease concept of alcoholism. There my drinking became so much worse that the boys in the fraternity house where I lived felt forced to send for my father, who made a long journey in the vain endeavor to get me straightened around. This had little effect, however, for I kept on drinking and used a great deal more hard liquor than in former years. So he's in some kind of a fraternity at this school that he's at now, and he drank so much that the fraternity guys had to send for his father because he got so drunk. Most people in fraternities drink all the time. They get drunk every night or every weekend or whatever. And if the boys in the fraternity have to call for help for you, you can just imagine how drunk Dr. Bob was. He must have been really, really, really overdoing it. And he's talking about here, now he's using more hard liquor than in former years. Evidently, he started out as a beer drinker. Now he's starting to drink hard liquor. You know, candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. So he's drinking more hard liquor, so he's getting more drunk, if he can get more drunk. So you can see the progression. His alcoholism is progressing here. It's taking on stronger, it's getting stronger for him. We're on the next paragraph on page 174. Coming up to final exams, I went on a particularly strenuous spree. When I went in to write the examinations, my hands trembled so I couldn't hold a pencil. I was at the point, the next day, he's trembling so much, he's got the jitters or the shake so bad, he can't even hold a pencil. Now, if you can see, this is like a correlation between him and Bill Wilson. If you remember in Bill's story, when Bill went to take his final exams for law school, he was too drunk to think or write. So alcohol affected Bill when he was trying to take his exams, and alcohol is affecting Dr. Bob when he was trying to take his exams. I passed in at least 3 absolutely blank books. I was, of course, soon on the carpet, and the upshot was that I had to go back for 2 more quarters and remain absolutely dry if I wished to graduate. When it says I was on the carpet means you're in trouble. That's an expression when you're on the carpet. That means you're in trouble. You have to go before the authorities, and you're probably going to get disciplined or reprimanded or whatever. And what they told him was he wasn't allowed to drink for 2 more quarters. He had to stay dry, and if he wants to graduate. This I did and proved to myself satisfactory to the faculty, both in deportment and scholastically. So he was able to stay dry, not drink for 2 more quarters. So evidently fear or whatever sobered him up for a while, just like Bill, fear sobered him for a while. So he was able to stay sober for 2 more quarters. So probably at this point in Dr. Bob's drinking, he probably didn't have, all the symptoms of alcoholism. He just had the physical part. When he took a drink, he couldn't stop, and he would just keep drinking until he got blasted. But when he stopped, if he had a reason or a fear or whatever, he could stay stopped. So he stayed stopped for 2 more quarters. The next paragraph. I conducted myself so credibly that I was able to secure a much coveted internship in a western city. That was Akron, Ohio, the western city. And the hospital where he went was the City Hospital of Akron, where I spent 2 years. During these 2 years, I was kept so busy that I hardly left the hospital at all. Consequently, I could not get into any trouble. So he was just working all the time. He was in the hospital, and he really couldn't drink when he was in the hospital, so he stayed out of trouble. So here's a guy, if you want to call him a periodic or whatever, he wasn't drinking all the time. He could stay sober when he had something else to do, but when he starts drinking, that's when he gets in trouble. When those 2 years were up, I opened an office downtown. I had some money, all the time in the world, and considerable stomach trouble. I soon discovered that a couple of drinks would alleviate my gastric distress, at least for a few hours at a time. So it was not at all difficult for me to return to my former excessive indulgence. He's starting to have stomach trouble. His stomach's bothering him, and he figured out if he takes a couple of drinks, his stomach calms down and he feels okay. And he's returned to his former excessive indulgence because he's got the physical part of alcoholism. He's got the allergy, the phenomenon of cravings. Once he starts drinking, he wants more and more and more. So he returns to his former excessive indulgence, and he starts drinking excessive amounts of alcohol again. By this time, I was beginning to pay very dearly physically, and in hope of relief, voluntarily incarcerated myself at least a dozen times in one of the local sanitariums. So Dr. Bob put himself in a sanitarium at least a dozen times. We would call that a rehab or a treatment center. So at least a dozen times he put himself voluntarily into some kind of a sanitarium so he would be able to stop drinking. I was between Scylla and Charybdis now, because if I did not drink, my stomach tortured me, and if I did, my nerves did the same thing. Scylla and Charybdis means you're between a rock and a hard place. So he's stuck in the middle here. If he drinks, his nerves drive him crazy the next morning, and if he doesn't drink, his stomach is torturing him. So whichever way he does it, he's still going to have problems. That's what he means by he's between Scylla and Charybdis. He's stuck between a rock and a hard place. Whichever way he goes, he's going to have problems. After 3 years of this, I wound up in a local hospital where they attempted to help me. But I would get my friends to smuggle me a quart, or I would steal the alcohol about the building, so that I got rapidly worse. So he wound up in the hospital where they're trying to help him, trying to sober him up or dry him out or whatever, and he has his friends smuggle him in a quart. So he has some booze to drink while he's in the hospital. Or he would sneak around the hospital and steal the alcohol. He worked in a hospital. He was a doctor. He did an internship in the hospital. He knows where everything is in the hospital. Hospitals have rubbing alcohol, and they also have ethyl alcohol, what we use that we drink. And they use it for making different kinds of medicine. When they make liquid medicine, they use alcohol because alcohol is a solvent, and it makes the different kinds of medication mixed together. And sometimes they use alcohol for different kinds of treatments in certain people. So he knew where the alcohol was in the hospital, and he would sneak around the hospital and steal the alcohol and drink it, or he had his friends smuggle him in stuff. So this is a guy that's not really trying to get better. He just went into the hospital probably just to, get over whatever was bothering him, whatever physical symptoms he was having, and then he was going to keep on drinking if he could. We're on the first new paragraph on 175. Finally, my father had to send a doctor out from my hometown who managed to get me back there in some way. And I was in bed about 2 months before I could venture out of the house. This is how bad Dr. Bob was. He spent 2 months in bed before he could even go out of the house again. So you can just imagine how much he drank and how much he was beat up by the alcohol, at least physically at this point. I stayed about town a couple of months more and then returned to resume my practice. I think I must have been thoroughly scared by what happened, or by the doctor, or probably both, so that I did not touch a drink again until the country went dry. So now he was scared by the doctor or by the fact that he had to go stay in bed for 2 months, so he didn't drink until the country went dry. The country went dry in 1920. That's referring to Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. All right, the next paragraph. When the passing of the 18th Amendment, I felt quite safe. I knew everybody would buy a few bottles or cases of liquor as their exchequers permitted, and that it would soon be gone. What they did when they came out with Prohibition, they voted on Prohibition in 1919, and they said it was going to start in 1920. I believe it was January 1st, 1920, they started Prohibition. So everybody had a warning that Prohibition was coming. So people would run out and buy as much liquor as they could. And he says, whatever their exchequers permitted, an exchequer is like your bank account or your treasury, how much money that you have. So people would go out and buy as much liquor as they could, and it would soon be gone. Therefore, it would make no great difference, even if I should do some drinking. So Dr. Bob thought that because they were coming out with Prohibition, he could drink all he wants to right now, because once alcohol is outlawed, he won't be able to get it anymore, and he'll have to stay sober. At that time, I was not aware of the almost unlimited supply the government made it possible for us doctors to obtain. Neither had I any knowledge of the bootlegger who soon appeared on the horizon. So this time, when they made alcohol illegal, doctors could get all they wanted. They could write prescriptions for alcohol, because whatever condition they use alcohol for, sometimes they use alcohol for treating patients, or sometimes they use it for mixing different medications together. When they make like a liquid medication, like cough medicine or something, that has alcohol in it because it makes all the stuff mixed together. So Dr. Bob could get all the alcohol he wanted. And then the bootlegger appeared on the horizon. That was the people that were selling this illegal alcohol, rum runners, whatever you want to call them. I drank with moderation at first, but it took me only a relatively short time to drift back into the whole old habits which had wound up so disastrously before. He's trying to do controlled drinking. He's trying to drink in moderation. That doesn't work for us. We can't control and enjoy our drinking. Once we try to control it, if you're an alcoholic, the physical part, the allergy kicks in, the phenomenon of cravings, and you have to have more and more and more. And it's only a short time before he wound up back just like he was before. And he's drinking to the point where now he's having problems with it. During the next few years, I developed two distinct phobias. One was the fear of not sleeping, and the other was the fear of running out of liquor. Not being a man of means, I knew that if I did not stay sober enough to earn money, I would run out of liquor. Most of the time, therefore, I did not take the morning drink, which I craved so badly, but instead would fill up on large doses of sedatives to quiet the jitters, which distressed me terribly. So now he's at the point, remember, he's a doctor, he has access to all different kinds of medication or drugs or whatever he needs for his business. So he figured out when he wakes up in the morning and he's shaking, he doesn't want to take a drink, because if he does, he won't be able to go to work and earn money to buy more alcohol. so he's taking sedatives instead because the sedatives are quieting down his jitters or his shakes. Occasionally, I would yield to the morning craving, but if I did, it would be only a few hours before I would be quite unfit for work. This would lessen my chances of smuggling some home that evening, which in turn would mean a night of futile tossing around in bed, followed by a morning of unbearable jitters. So he's got to buy alcohol. If he doesn't buy alcohol, he can't sleep at night. He's losing sleep. And then when he does drink the alcohol, he wakes up with the jitters. So whatever he does, he's in trouble here at this point. During the subsequent 15 years, I had sense enough never to go to the hospital if I had been drinking, and very seldom did I receive patients. I would sometimes hide out in one of the clubs of which I was a member, and had a habit at times of registering in a hotel under a fictitious name. He was smart enough not to show up at the hospital when he was drinking because he knew he wouldn't be able to stop drinking. He would keep drinking. They would smell the alcohol on him, and he would, embarrass himself or get sent home or whatever they do when you show up at a hospital drunk. And then he tried to hide out in some of the clubs that he was a member, and he would register in a hotel under a fictitious name. That means a fake name. His name was Bob Smith. I don't know what name he used. Maybe John Smith? I mean, really, that seems a little silly to me. But my friends usually found me, and I would go home if they promised that I should not be scolded. If my wife was planning to go out in the afternoon, I would get a large supply of liquor and smuggle it home and hide it in a coal bin. The closed chutes over the door jambs, over beams in the cellar, and cracks in the cellar tile. I also made the use of old trunks and chests, the old can container, and the ash container. The water tank on the toilet I never used because that looked too easy. I found out later that my wife inspected it frequently. I used to put 8 or 12-ounce bottles of alcohol in a fur-lined glove and toss it onto the back airing porch when winter days got dark enough. My bootlegger had hidden alcohol at the back steps where I could get it at my convenience. So in other words, at this point, Dr. Bob's hiding liquor all over his house. Every place you can think of, he's putting it. Everywhere except in the back of the toilet tank because that looked too obvious. He's hiding it every place that he can. He's got booze hidden all over the place. Anybody identify with that? Hiding your bottles all around. So if anybody finds them, he's still got more. And that's exactly what he was doing. Sometimes I would bring it into my pockets, but they were inspected, and that became too risky. I used also to put it up in 4-ounce bottles and stick several in my stocking tops. This worked nicely until my wife and I went to see Wallace Berry in Tugboat Annie, after which the pant leg and stocking racket were out. That was a famous play that they had back in the day, Tugboat Annie, and I guess the person in there was hiding bottles in their stocking tops or whatever, and that's what he was doing. And after they saw that, that racket was out because then his wife knew about it. Well, on the top of page 177, I will not take space to relate all my hospital or sanitary experiences. I don't know how many hospitals he was in or how many sanitariums, but evidently this guy went for treatment quite a lot. He said that he went into a sanitarium at least a dozen times. They talked about that already, and then he's been in the hospital a few times. So he's having physical problems from alcohol, and he still keeps drinking because that's what alcoholics do. During this time, we became more or less ostracized by our friends. That means they were shunned or they were outcasts. We could not be invited out because I would surely get tight, and my wife dared not invite people in for the same reason. In other words, he wasn't getting invited anywhere, and they didn't want to invite anybody to their home because he was going to get drunk all the time. My phobia for sleeplessness demanded that I get drunk every night. But in order to get more liquor for the next night, I had to stay sober during the day, at least up to 4 o'clock. This routine went on with few interruptions for 17 years. It was really a horrible nightmare. This earning money, getting liquor, smuggling it home, getting drunk, morning jitters, taking large doses of sedatives to make it possible for me to earn more money, and so on ad nauseum. Ad nauseum means to a sickening degree. So for 17 years, Dr. Bob is drinking at night because he thinks he can't sleep without drinking. He's drinking at night, getting drunk, going to sleep, waking up with the morning jitters, and he has to take large doses of sedatives so that he can go to work, because he can't go to work shaking, and he can't drink to stop shaking because then he won't make it to work. So he's doing sedatives and alcohol. It's a good thing that he didn't OD on something. I mean, when you're mixing different things like that together, even though you're not taking them at the same time with each other, it's very possible to OD, and you can wake up, in the morgue somewhere. I used to promise my wife, my friends, and my children that I would drink no more. Promises which seldom kept me sober, even through the day, though I was very sincere when I made them. How many of us made those promises? We're never going to drink again. And we really, really meant it. And some short circuits in our brain, it makes us drink when we don't want to drink. So now he's at the point where he's drinking even when he doesn't want to drink. He's promising not to drink. He's swearing he's never going to drink again, and he winds up drinking. We're on the bottom of page 177. For the benefit of those experimentally inclined, I should mention the so-called beer experiment. When beer first came back, I thought that I was safe. I could drink all I wanted of that. It was harmless. Nobody ever got drunk on beer. So I filled the cellar full with the permission of my good wife. He filled the cellar full with beer. He didn't go out and buy a couple of six-packs. He got as much as he could. I mean, so you can see that this guy is a full-blown alcoholic. He's over the top, It was not long before I was drinking at least a case and a half a day. A case is 24. A case and a half would be 36. 36 bottles of beer, or I don't know if they had cans back then, but they had bottles. So he's drinking 36 bottles of beer. That's a lot of volume to drink. I put on 30 pounds of weight in about 2 months, looked like a pig, and was uncomfortable from shortness of breath. Then it occurred to me that after one was all smelled up with beer, nobody could tell what had been drunk. So I began to fortify my beer with straight alcohol. Of course, the result was very bad, and that ended the beer experiment. So now he's trying to mix alcohol with beer to make the beer stronger so he doesn't have to drink so much. He figured out that you get drunker drinking the straight alcohol than you do just drinking the beer because it's faster. You can still get drunk on beer, it just takes a lot more to do it. All right, we're on the top of page 78, the first new paragraph. About the time of the beer experiment, I was thrown in with a crowd of people who attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. This was the Oxford group in Akron that he's talking about here. They spoke with great freedom from embarrassment, which I could never do, and they seemed very much at ease on all occasions and appeared very healthy. More than these attributes, they seemed to be happy. I was self-conscious and ill at ease most of the time. My health was at the breaking point, and I was thoroughly miserable. I sensed I had something I did not have, from which I might readily profit. I learned that it was something of a spiritual nature, which did not appeal to me very much, but I thought it could do no harm. I gave the matter much study for the next 2.5 years, but still got tight every night nevertheless. I read everything I could find and talked to everyone who I thought knew anything about it. So for 2.5 years, he was in the Oxford group trying to see if that would help him. But the Oxford group couldn't help Dr. Bob because they didn't have the same problem that Dr. Bob did. The Oxford group was about not sinning, about going to heaven, about being saved. And Dr. Bob just wanted to know what to do about alcoholism, how to stop drinking. And there was virtually no alcoholics in where Dr. Bob was in Akron in the Oxford group. So they were all talking about lying, cheating, stealing, how to stop sinning, that kind of stuff. And Dr. Bob was not identifying with them because they weren't talking about what to do to get sober. they might have told Dr. Bob, why don't you pray about it? Why don't you talk to somebody about it? But they didn't have any information on what to do. When Bill finally talked to Bob, Bill had information from his own experience. These people didn't have any experience with alcohol. So nothing, gelled with Dr. Bob and the Oxford group. So for 2.5 years, he was there. And so this was approximately in the beginning of 1933 when he went there, and he didn't get sober until June of 1935, which would be 2.5 years after he went to the Oxford group. That's when Bill got in touch with him. My wife became deeply interested, and it was her interest that sustained mine, though I had at no time sensed that it might be an answer to my liquor problem. So, in other words, his wife got him to go there. His wife sustained his interest in the Oxford group. She basically dragged him there is pretty much what happened. How my wife kept her faith and courage during all those years, I'll never know, but she did. If she had not, I know I would have been dead a long time ago. For some reason, we alcoholics have the gift of picking out the world's finest women. Well, why they should be subjected to the tortures we inflict upon them, I cannot explain. About this time, a lady called up my wife on Saturday afternoon saying she wanted me to come over that evening to meet a friend of hers who might help me. It was the day before Mother's Day, and I had come home plastered, carrying a big potted plant, which I set down on the table and forthwith went upstairs and passed out. The next day she called again, wishing to be polite. Though I felt very badly, I said, let's make the call, and extracted from my wife a promise that we would not stay over 15 minutes. This is Henrietta Seiberling or Seiberling, however you pronounce it. Then she called up Dr. Bob, and she got Dr. Bob's wife on the phone because Dr. Bob was drunk, and she wanted Dr. Bob to come over because Bill had got in touch with her. He made the phone calls, and he got in touch with her and said he had a way of helping drunks. And Dr. Bob couldn't go that night, but they said they would come the next day, and Henrietta invited them all for dinner the next day. And Dr. Bob said he would go, but he made his wife promise they were only going to stay 15 minutes. Thank God they stayed longer. If he only would have stayed 15 minutes, he never would have heard anything that Bill had to say, and he never would have got sober, and AA probably wouldn't have started, or would have started with different people, and who knows what would have happened. All right, the next paragraph. We entered our house at exactly 5 o'clock, and it was 11:15 when we left. 6 hours and 15 minutes he stayed there, and he was only going to stay for 15 minutes. So evidently Bill was very long-winded and had a lot to talk to him about. I don't know how long they actually talked. I don't know how long the greeting takes when you go to somebody's house before him and Bill went in another room and talked, but they must have talked for 5 or 6 hours or whatever. I had a couple of shorter talks with this man afterwards and stopped drinking abruptly. This dry spell lasted for about 3 weeks. Then I went to Atlantic City to attend several days' meeting of a national society of which I was a member. I drank all the scotch they had on the train and bought several quarts on my way to the hotel. So he stayed sober for approximately 3 weeks. He went to Atlantic City. They were having a convention for the American Medical Association, and he drank all the scotch that they had on the train. I don't know how much scotch they had, but he drank everything he got his hands on the train. And then he bought several quarts on the way to the hotel. So he's on a run at this. He's really going at this point. This was on Sunday. I got tight that night, stayed sober Monday till after dinner, then proceeded to get tight again. I drank all I dared in the bar, then went to my room to finish the job. So he went in the bar and started drinking with the other people that were there at this convention, and he didn't want to get real drunk and embarrass himself in front of everybody. So he went back up to his room where he had his quarts of scotch to finish the job. So he has to have a few drinks before he drinks and gets drunk. And that's exactly what he was doing at this point. Tuesday, I started in the morning, got well organized by noon. I believe that means he was drunk by noon. He was well organized. He started drinking in the morning and he was blasted by noon. I did not want to disgrace myself, so I checked out. I bought some more liquor on the way to the depot. I had to wait some time for the train, and I remember nothing from then on until I woke up at a friend's house near home. So he went back to get on the train. He bought more liquor to take on the train with him, and he was sitting there drinking and waiting for the train, and he must have been in blackout. The next thing he knows, he wakes up in Akron and at one of his friend's house. These good people notified my wife, who sent my newly made friend over to get me. So basically what happened was, when he got to the depot, I don't know who made the phone call. Somebody called up the office nurse that worked in his office. And the nurse and her husband came down and picked Dr. Bob up at the train depot, and they brought him back to their home. And then they called Dr. Bob's wife, and she sent Bill Wilson over to get him. We came home. He came and got me home and to bed. He gave me a few drinks that night and one bottle of beer the next morning. That was June 10th, 1935, and that was my last drink. As I write, nearly 4 years have passed. So Bill brought him home, gave him a couple of drinks that night so he could go to sleep and go to bed, and then however they tried to detox him, he gave him one bottle of beer the next morning. That would be the morning that he was supposed to go for surgery to keep him from shaking. And again, different people argue over whether it was June 10th or June 17th. And to me, it doesn't matter. If he got drunk a week later or a week earlier, I really don't care. Because I'm sober and that doesn't affect my sobriety one way or another. The question which might naturally come to your mind would be, what did this man do or say that was different from what others had done or said? It must be remembered that I had read a great deal and talked to everyone I knew or thought they knew anything about the subject of alcoholism. But this was a man who had experienced many years of frightful drinking, who had most of all the drunkard's experiences known to man, but who had been cured by the very means I had been trying to employ. That is to say, the spiritual approach. He gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which was undoubtedly helpful. And I have this in italics. That means it's important. Of far more importance was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regards to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he picked them up in his reading. In other words, one alcoholic has the ability to get through to another alcoholic like no non-alcoholic can. They told us that back on page 18, that the ex-problem drinker who has the facts about himself can get the confidence of another alcoholic in a few hours. They told us that on page 18, and that's basically what he's saying here again. Because Bill Wilson was an alcoholic who drank the same way that Dr. Bob did. Dr. Bob identified with him. He wasn't listening to some doctor or some know-it-all that read a book about alcoholism telling him, why don't you use your willpower? Why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Why don't you just quit drinking? All that kind of stuff. When Bill told Dr. Bob about Bill's drinking, Dr. Bob identified with him. That's what's important in trying to help somebody else get sober, that they identify with you. Because if they don't identify with you, they're not going to listen to you. I know myself, I never listened to anybody that told me to stop drinking because they didn't know what they were talking about because they didn't drink like me. And when I came to AA and I heard people talking about how they drank and they drank like me, I was willing to listen to them. That identification is really, really, really important. All right, we're on the bottom of page 180. It is the most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse which I was afflicted. My health is good, and I have regained my self-respect and the respect of my colleagues. My home life is ideal, and my business is as good as can be expected in these uncertain times. I spend a great deal of time passing on what I had learned to others who wanted and needed badly. I do it for 4 reasons. Notice it says he spends a great deal of time passing it on. You can ask yourself a question. Do I pass this on to other people? Because that's what we're supposed to do. Because that's what keeps us sober. All right, we're on the top of page 181. And these are the 4 reasons that he does it. A sense of duty. That's 1. 2, it is a pleasure. When you try to help somebody else, you will make you feel better. You will get pleasure out of that. 3, because in doing so, I am paying my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me. That's how we give back. That's how we pay back, by passing this message on. And 4, because every time I do it, I take out a little more insurance for myself against a possible slip. In other words, when you carry this message to someone else, that gives you insurance against a possible slip. That helps make your program stronger. Because every time you take someone through this program, you're actually going through it again. And it makes you practice what you preach. All right, we're on the first new paragraph on 181. Unlike most of our crowd, I did not get over my cravings for liquor much during my first 2.5 years of abstinence. So Dr. Bob was still having urges, or if you want to call them cravings, during his first 2.5 years. It was almost always with me, but at no time have I been anywhere near yielding. I used to get terribly upset when I saw my friends drink and knew I could not. But I schooled myself to believe that though I had once had the same privilege, I had abused it so frightfully that it was withdrawn. So it doesn't behoove me to squawk about it, for after all, nobody had ever thrown me down and poured liquor down my throat. Behoove means seem necessary. So it doesn't seem necessary for him to squawk about it or complain about it. He can't drink, and that's that. He accepts that. And he was white-knuckling it for quite a while in the beginning, because his urges or desire to drink didn't go away 1, 2, 3, but they went away enough that he could deal with it. If you think you are an atheist or an agnostic, a skeptic, or of any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what's in this book, I feel sorry for you. If you still think you are strong enough to beat the game alone, that is your affair. But if you really and truly want to quit drinking for good and all, and sincerely feel that you must have some help, we know that we have an answer for you. It never fails if you go about it with half the zeal you have been in the habit of showing when you were getting another drink. If you put half of the effort into getting sober that you put into getting drunk, you're not going to fail. That's basically what he's saying. In other words, you have to do it. You got to do your part. And the last line, your heavenly Father will never let you down. Basically, if you get your higher power in your life, the higher power is not going to let you down. Your relationship with your higher power is what's going to keep you sober and take away your obsession or desire or craving to drink. All right, we're up on the top of the hour. Thanks a lot for letting me share. Does everybody understand this? Any comments or questions?
Great stuff, Bill. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I was writing like mad and highlighting. Thank you again. And thank you, Leo.
Hey, thank you for being here.
You bet, Sherry. Thanks. All right, we'll close out with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.